The sun had barely started to rise that day, casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. I had just finished my morning routine, a habit that had kept me grounded for years. It was routine, predictable, and comforting. I had never been one to expect surprises. Life had a way of playing out just as it always had, and that was enough for me. But today was different. Something felt off. Jason, my only son, was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. He looked the same as he always did, dressed in his work clothes, hair slightly tousled, carrying that weary expression that seemed to come with his demanding job. The lines around his eyes were deepening, and the stress seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. But there was more to it today. Something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place, made me uneasy. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice soft but not without a strange edge to it. He held out a glass of water, offering it to me with a forced smile. It was such an ordinary gesture, one that I had seen countless times before. But this time it didn't feel right. I took the glass from him, my fingers brushing against his. It was cold. A chill seemed to run through me as I looked at him more closely. "Thanks," I replied, my voice betraying the sense of unease creeping up inside of me. He didn't sit down, didn't linger as he usually did for a quick chat. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me like he was waiting for something. As I drank the water, my mind wandered back to what I had overheard just the day before. I had gone to visit him at his office, hoping to grab a quick coffee and catch up. But what I didn't expect was to walk into a conversation that would change everything. Jason had been on the phone when I arrived, speaking in a hushed voice, something I'd never really noticed before. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I overheard a conversation that chilled me to my core. He was discussing something with someone on the other end of the line, something about life insurance. My name had come up, followed by words I couldn't ignore: policy, death benefit, and cash out. My heart had dropped in that moment, and I froze. Jason had taken out a life insurance policy on me? The thought was too absurd to comprehend, yet the more I replayed the conversation in my mind, the more I realized it was true. I couldn't bring myself to ask him about it then and there. It felt like something I wasn't ready to confront. But I couldn't ignore it either. The suspicion had planted itself deep in my mind, and the doubt began to fester. Now, as I sat there with the glass of water in my hands, the words echoed louder in my mind. Why would he do this? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a betrayal. How could my own son, the one I had raised and nurtured, possibly think of me as a financial asset? A mere statistic in some cold insurance contract? The glass of water seemed to grow heavier in my hands, like the weight of my thoughts was being poured into it. Jason stood there, waiting for a response, though I wasn't sure what he was expecting. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The silence between us was uncomfortable, stretching out longer than it should have. He had always been the one to fill the silence, but today, it was like a barrier had formed between us, one that neither of us knew how to cross. I tried to focus on the water in my hands, the cool liquid that seemed to offer no comfort. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice breaking the silence. "Why did you take a life insurance policy on me?" It was a question that had been burning in my mind for hours, and though I feared the answer, I needed to hear it. Jason's face faltered for a second, and he quickly looked away, like he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. "What are you talking about?" he asked, the same forced calm in his voice, but I could hear the edge in his words now. His answer didn't fool me. I had heard enough. I felt a wave of anger, but more than that, I felt an overwhelming sadness. This was my son, the boy I had raised, loved, and protected. The boy who had once looked at me with admiration in his eyes, who once trusted me with his fears and dreams. Now it felt like I didn't know him at all. It wasn't just the money or the policy. It was the breach of trust. It was the idea that he could see me as something to be used, something to be profited from. But despite all the questions swirling in my mind, I held myself together. I didn't yell. I didn't break down. I simply sat there staring at Jason, waiting for him to say something, anything that could explain what I had just discovered. Jason finally met my gaze, but there was nothing in his eyes that told me the truth. Nothing that showed regret or understanding. Just a quiet tension, thick in the air between us. And as I looked at him, I realized something else. There was more to this than I could understand, more than I had yet uncovered. That evening, I would decide I couldn't let it go. I would confront him. I had to, because if I didn't, I would never be able to trust him again. And that was the hardest part of all, the thought that the bond we once shared could never be the same again. The days following the discovery were tense, like walking on a tightrope, unsure whether it would snap at any moment. Jason and I barely spoke to each other. He went about his life as if nothing had happened, while I found myself overwhelmed by the thoughts of the conversation I had overheard. I replayed it in my mind, over and over again. My son, the one I had cared for and trusted more than anyone, had taken out a life insurance policy on me. The revelation felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine. Every time I looked at him, I saw the glass of water he had handed me, a subtle reminder of how much was left unsaid. I needed to confront him, had to, because if I didn't, I would never be able to move forward. The weight of the secret was crushing me. The anger, the hurt, and the betrayal were all swirling inside, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. That evening, when Jason came home from work, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait another day. I had been silent long enough. The quiet between us had become unbearable. The usual hum of life, the easy banter, the shared meals had all faded away. Now, all that was left was the unspeakable truth hanging between us, like an invisible wall. When he walked through the door, I didn't let him get far before I stood up. I could feel my heartbeat thundering in my chest as I looked at him. He looked tired as usual, but there was something else in his eyes. A flicker of guilt, of knowing that something was about to break. For the first time in a long time, his usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something different. He wasn't the confident, self-assured man I had always known. Today he looked smaller, almost fragile. "Jason," I said, my voice trembling, just slightly. "We need to talk." He stopped in his tracks, sensing the gravity of my tone. For a moment, there was silence. He didn't ask what about, didn't offer a casual reply, which made the air even thicker with tension. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, He nodded, his eyes wary. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I know what you did, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. I know you took out a life insurance policy on me. Why, Jason? Why would you do that? The words hung in the air, stark and painful. I saw his face freeze for a split second, like he was processing the very question I had been struggling to comprehend. His expression shifted. Anxiety and guilt twisted his features, but no words came out at first. He looked at the floor, then at me, and back again, clearly unsure of how to respond. His lips parted, but no sound came out. I couldn't take it anymore. Why, Jason? I repeated, louder this time, my voice breaking. Why would you do something like that to your own mother? Finally, he exhaled sharply, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the emotions he had been holding inside. He looked up at me then, but his gaze was clouded with guilt. Mom, he began, his voice soft but strained. I didn't want you to find out like this. He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair, clearly trying to find the right words. Then tell me, I demanded, my frustration boiling over. Tell me why you thought it was okay to do something like this behind my back. Why would you think it's okay to take out a life insurance policy on me? Jason looked pained, as if my words had struck him deeply. He shifted uncomfortably, and, for the first time, I saw him as vulnerable. Not the strong, self-assured son I had raised, but a young man who was struggling with something much bigger than either of us had realized. It's not what you think, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do it because I wanted to hurt you, Mom. I was scared. There's a lot you don't know. I felt a twinge of confusion. Scared? Scared of what, Jason? He hesitated, glancing down again, this time staring at his hands, which were trembling. The business, Mom. It's failing. I've been hiding it from you, trying to keep it together. But the truth is, we're in serious debt. I've tried everything, but it's not enough. I thought if something happened to you, at least I could cover the costs. It wasn't about you. It was about survival. I didn't want to burden you with this. I didn't want you to know how bad things had gotten. His words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I stood there, processing everything he had just revealed. The weight of his confession hit me like a wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. Jason, my son, was drowning. The facade of stability that he had always put up, the sense of control, had all been a lie. He was struggling just as much as I was. And the life insurance policy wasn't about seeing me as a financial asset. It was about desperation. My heart softened a little, but the hurt didn't disappear. The trust had been broken, but at least I now understood why he had done what he did. He had been overwhelmed with fear of losing everything, and had made a choice that, in hindsight, seemed foolish. But, for him, it had felt like the only option. I didn't want to disappoint you, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want you to see me like this. I thought if I could just hold it all together, I could fix it without you knowing. But I was wrong. I should have come to you. I should have been honest. I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. You're right, I said quietly. You should have come to me. We could have figured it out together. The silence between us stretched, but it wasn't as thick as it had been before. There was something fragile and broken about the way we both stood there, but there was also a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this confrontation was the first step in rebuilding the relationship that had been fractured. But, as I stood there, I knew that things wouldn't be the same. Trust had to be earned back, and it would take time. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of healing, not just for him, but for both of us. Jason's confession hung in the air, thick with raw emotion, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I sat there, stunned, grappling with the implications of what he had just revealed. The life insurance policy, this cold, calculated act, wasn't about what I had first imagined. It wasn't about him wanting me to disappear, to benefit from my death. It wasn't about greed or malice. It was about fear. A fear so deep, so consuming, that it had led him to make a choice I never would have expected. "I never wanted you to find out like this," Jason repeated, his voice cracking. His eyes were averted, and he seemed to be struggling with his words. He wasn't the confident, composed man I had once known. Today, he was vulnerable, defeated even. The walls he had built between us over the years were now crumbling before me. I didn't know what else to do. He continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The business is failing, Mom. It's all falling apart. I didn't want to tell you, didn't want to burden you with it. But I was running out of options. I was desperate. Desperation." That word pierced me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't an excuse, but it made everything clearer. Jason, the son I had raised, had always carried the weight of responsibility like a shield. He had prided himself on being independent, self-sufficient, never asking for help. But now I saw the cracks in that armor, the fear behind his actions. "What happened?" I asked softly, needing to know more. I had always seen him as the strong one, the one who could handle anything that came his way. Now I realized just how much he had been carrying alone. Jason took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he wiped them across his face. "The business, it's a disaster. I made bad decisions, took risks, and now it's all catching up to me. The debts are mounting, and I've tried everything to turn it around. But I'm losing it all. I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want you to know how much I was struggling." The words hit me harder than I anticipated. Jason had always been the picture of ambition and self-reliance. I had never questioned his ability to succeed. But now I understood that beneath the surface, he had been drowning in fear. And when fear takes hold, it has a way of distorting the truth, of making people do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. He continued, his voice breaking as he spoke. I thought that if something happened to you, I could at least cover the costs. I could pay off the debts, start fresh. I never wanted it to be like this. It wasn't about you, Mom. It was about survival. I was silent for a long time, processing his words. The shock of it all settled in waves, washing over me in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't the son I had known. This wasn't the boy who had once shared everything with me, who had trusted me with his deepest fears and dreams. The distance between us had grown over the years, but this was something I never imagined. Jason, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You should have come to me. We could have figured this out together. You don't have to carry this on your own." His eyes filled with tears, and he dropped his head into his hands. "I didn't want to disappoint you," he admitted. "I didn't want you to see me fail. I thought if I just kept it together, you'd never know. But it got too much. The fear, the lies, it all became too much." His words were raw, unfiltered. And though it hurt to hear them, I could feel the weight of his truth pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the policy. It was about the years of strain, of trying to live up to expectations, of hiding his struggles behind a facade of strength. "I didn't want to lose you," he continued, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to think about what would happen if I couldn't fix things. I thought I could make it all go away. But now I've ruined everything." His words struck me deep. The desperation, the fear of losing everything, including me, had driven him to do something drastic. He had been so focused on the business, so consumed by the weight of it, that he hadn't considered what the cost would be to our relationship. But in that moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't trying to take advantage of me. He wasn't plotting something sinister. He was simply lost, afraid, and trying to find a way out of the mess he had created. As I looked at him, sitting there on the edge of the couch, broken and vulnerable, I realized that this wasn't about the money. This was about a son who had fallen into a pit of fear and uncertainty, a son who had made a choice that he thought would fix everything but had instead pushed him further into despair. I reached out and placed a hand on his, the warmth of my touch grounding us both in the moment. "Jason, we're family. You don't have to go through this alone. We'll figure it out. Together." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and shame. "You're not angry?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Hurt," I said honestly, "but not angry. I understand why you did it, even though I don't agree with it. You were trying to protect us both, but in the process, you pushed me away. We'll fix this, Jason. But we need to start by being honest with each other. No more secrets." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jason nodded, the weight of his burden lightening just a little. It wasn't over. The road ahead would be difficult, and trust would need to be rebuilt. But at least, in this moment, we had taken the first step toward healing, toward understanding each other once more. The truth had been revealed, and it was painful, but it also opened the door to a new beginning. The silence between us lingered after the conversation, heavy with the weight of everything Jason had shared. Despite the pain, the bitterness that had festered in my chest began to ease, but the uncertainty of what came next hung in the air. The revelation about the life insurance policy had cracked the surface of our relationship, but there was still so much to work through. The foundation we had built over the years felt fragile, and I knew that it would take more than just words to restore it. The days following that evening were filled with a mixture of quiet moments and painful realizations. Jason began to open up more, not just about the business, but about the emotional toll it had taken on him. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't hiding behind his walls of pride and independence. I saw the man he had become, a man weighed down by fear and failure, and yet, as I watched him struggle, I also saw glimpses of the young boy who had once confided in me, who had looked up to me for guidance and comfort. We began spending more time together. He would come home early from work, not to escape the pressures of his business, but to sit with me, to talk, to reflect. It wasn't easy for either of us. There were still moments of tension, and I could feel the hesitation in him when we broached the subject of his mistakes. But the more we spoke, the more I understood that this wasn't about the policy or the business. It was about Jason's need to prove himself, to protect me from the harsh realities of life, even if it meant doing something he would later regret. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Jason finally admitted something that had been eating away at him for years. "I never asked for help," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I didn't want anyone to know that I was struggling. I thought I could handle it on my own, that if I just worked harder, everything would work out. But I was wrong, and now I don't know how to fix it." I watched him, heart aching for him. I had always known Jason as the strong, independent person who never needed anyone's help. But the reality was, he had been carrying his burdens alone, too proud to admit that he couldn't do it all by himself. In a way, I had been guilty of the same thing. I had focused so much on keeping our family together, on protecting him, that I hadn't seen the cracks in his armor. We had both been hiding from the truth in our own ways. "I don't want you to fix it alone, Jason," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We're a family. We've been through a lot together, and we'll get through this too. But we need to face it, together. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." His eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in them. It wasn't the same look of desperation I had seen before, but something more sincere, something that told me he was beginning to believe in the possibility of change, of healing. Over the next few weeks, we took small steps toward rebuilding our relationship. Jason sought professional help for his business, something he had been too proud to consider before. He also took a hard look at his finances, starting with the debts that had threatened to swallow him whole. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of frustration when it seemed like the weight of it all was too much to bear. But he was no longer alone in the struggle. I was there, by his side, helping him navigate the difficult decisions and conversations that lay ahead. But it wasn't just about the business. We also began repairing the emotional distance between us. Jason had always been my son, but for years it had felt like we were living parallel lives, existing in the same space but never really connecting. Now we were learning to communicate, to be honest with each other, and to share our fears and vulnerabilities. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. And with each conversation, we began to rebuild the trust that had been broken. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Jason looked at me with a sincerity I hadn't seen in years. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "I know I've let you down. I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know how to ask for help." I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch. "You don't need to apologize for that, Jason," I said softly. "We all have our struggles. We all have our moments of weakness. What matters is that we learn from them and that we move forward, together." The days that followed were filled with more small victories, more moments of connection. Jason was still working hard to repair the damage he had caused, but I could see the determination in him, the willingness to fight for what mattered most. And as for me, I was learning how to let go of my own fears, to stop holding on so tightly to the idea of perfection. I had always tried to protect Jason, to shield him from the harshness of the world, but now I realized that the best way to help him was to be there, to support him, and to trust that together we could face anything. One afternoon, as I watched Jason sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing his business plans, I realized how much had changed. The man who had once been too proud to ask for help was now asking for guidance, seeking support, and opening up about his struggles. The son I had feared I had lost was slowly coming back to me, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the courage he had shown in facing his mistakes. For the first time in a long time, I believed that we could rebuild not just his business but our family. The road ahead would be difficult, but I knew that with honesty, trust, and love, we could overcome anything. We had already taken the first step, and that was all that mattered. The healing had begun, and the future, though uncertain, now felt full of possibility. The days after our heart-to-heart conversation were filled with both progress and setbacks, moments of hope followed by feelings of doubt. It was a delicate process, the rebuilding of trust, and though we were both trying, there were times when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to shake off. But as each day passed, something shifted. Slowly, the emotional distance between Jason and me began to close. We began to find our rhythm again, not as mother and son who had been estranged by silence and fear, but as two people who had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and were now working toward something better. Jason's commitment to making things right was evident in his actions. He had enrolled in a financial management course to better understand how to handle his debts and business decisions, and he was meeting with a counselor to address the emotional toll the situation had taken on him. These were things I never imagined he would do. I had always seen him as someone who could solve problems on his own, who prided himself on his independence. But here he was, admitting that he needed help, that he couldn't do it alone. And it wasn't just about fixing the business or the finances. The real change was in his willingness to be vulnerable, to open up to me in a way he hadn't done in years. Our conversations became more frequent and more honest. Gone were the defensive walls he had built around himself. Instead, we found ourselves talking not just about the business, but about our past, about the things we had never said to each other. He shared with me the burdens he had been carrying, the failures he had never felt comfortable talking about, and the fear of disappointing me that had haunted him for so long. I began to realize that the life insurance policy, though a symbol of his desperation, was only a small part of the much bigger picture. It wasn't just about money. It was about a son who had been afraid of failure, afraid of letting me down, and who, in his fear, had made decisions he now regretted. But what struck me most was that he was finally confronting that fear, no longer hiding behind it. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Jason and I sat together on the porch, the silence between us comfortable for the first time in months. The air was cool, the stars bright above us, and for the first time in a long time, I could feel the weight lifting off both of us. Jason had just finished telling me about a small victory he'd had at work. He had secured a small deal that would help get the business back on track. It wasn't a big win, but it was a start, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I think we might be okay, Mom," Jason said quietly. his voice softer than usual. "I don't know how long it's going to take, but we're going to make it. I'm going to make it." His words were simple, but they held so much meaning. I could see the determination in his face, the same fire that had once driven him to succeed, now fueled by a deeper understanding of himself and his values. The fear that had once controlled him was still there, but it no longer dictated his every move. And that was the change I had been hoping for, the change in his mindset, in the way he saw his failures not as the end, but as lessons that would guide him toward a better future. I nodded, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. "I know you will," I said, my voice steady. "You've got the strength to turn this around, Jason, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you, every step of the way." The words felt like a promise, and as I spoke them, I realized that I wasn't just making a promise to him. I was making it to myself, too. We had both made mistakes, but those mistakes didn't have to define us. What mattered now was how we chose to move forward. I knew that our relationship wasn't going to be magically fixed overnight. Trust would take time to rebuild, and there would be bumps along the way. But the most important thing was that we were both willing to try. Over the next few weeks, Jason continued to make progress. His business began to show signs of recovery, and though there were still difficult days, there was a renewed sense of hope in our home. I could see the pride returning to his eyes, but it wasn't the pride of a man who thought he could do everything alone. It was the pride of someone who had faced his fears, accepted his mistakes, and was now working to make things right. Our conversations continued to grow deeper, and slowly, the emotional distance between us began to close. I no longer saw him as the son who had betrayed me with a life insurance policy. Instead, I saw him as a man who had made a choice out of fear, but who was now learning to face his fears with courage. And I saw him as my son again, the boy who had once shared his dreams with me, the one who had always looked to me for guidance and support. That connection was slowly being restored, one conversation at a time. As we worked together to heal the rift, I also began to reflect on my own role in our relationship. I had spent so many years trying to protect Jason from the world, from the pain I had experienced, from the mistakes I had made. But in doing so, I had inadvertently created a barrier between us. I had assumed that by shielding him from the harsh realities of life, I was protecting him. But I now saw that the best thing I could do for him, and for myself, was to allow him to face those challenges head-on, with my support, not my protection. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but as we sat together that night, watching the stars above us, I knew that we were stronger than we had been before. We had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and we had begun the process of healing. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be moments of doubt and fear. But together, we would face whatever came next. And that, in itself, was enough to give me hope for the future. As the days passed, Jason and I found ourselves growing closer, not just as mother and son, but as two people who had learned the hard way that facing the truth was the only way to move forward. The road ahead was long, but with each step we were learning to trust each other again, and that was all that mattered. In the end, it was the bond between us that would carry us through, stronger, more resilient, and ready for whatever the future held. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the emotional distance between Jason and me continued. to shrink. What once seemed like an insurmountable rift was now starting to feel more like a gap that could be bridged. Jason had shown such determination to turn his life around, and although the road to recovery wasn't smooth, the changes in him were undeniable. He wasn't the same man who had hidden behind his pride and fear. He had become someone who faced his failures head-on, accepted responsibility, and, most importantly, allowed himself to be vulnerable. The transformation was slow, but it was real. It wasn't just his business that was getting back on track, it was our relationship. Over time, I realized how much of his struggle had been about feeling unworthy, about thinking he had to do everything on his own. His actions, especially the life insurance policy, had stemmed from a place of deep fear and desperation. But what he needed wasn't a quick fix or an escape plan. It was support, understanding, and the freedom to face his challenges without shame. And that was what I had learned to give him. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I looked at Jason and saw the man he had become. His face, once tense with worry and regret, now had a more peaceful expression. It wasn't just that things were starting to improve financially. It was the way he carried himself. There was a quiet strength in him, the strength that had always been there, but had been hidden beneath layers of fear and guilt. "Mom," Jason said quietly one evening, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "I want to say thank you for everything. I don't think I ever really understood how much you've done for me, how much you've always been there. I guess I thought I could do it all myself, but now I see how wrong I was." I could see the sincerity in his eyes. It was a small moment, but it meant the world to me. For years, I had watched Jason shoulder the weight of the world, thinking he had to do everything alone. Now, he was asking for help, and he was acknowledging the love and support that had always been there. I smiled and placed my hand on his. "You don't have to thank me, Jason," I replied softly. "I'm your mother. I'm always going to be here for you, no matter what. But I'm proud of you, for facing your fears, for being honest, and for learning to ask for help. That's something you should be proud of." Jason smiled back at me, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. I didn't realize how much I needed you, how much I've taken you for granted, but I won't make that mistake again." It was the first time in a long while that I had seen that kind of openness in him. The wall he had built up between us was gone. The silence that had once hung between us was now filled with understanding. We had both learned something valuable, that we didn't have to carry our burdens alone, that healing required honesty, and that family wasn't just about being there when things were good, but also when things were hard. As the months went by, we continued to rebuild. The business, though still struggling, was beginning to show signs of recovery. Jason had taken the necessary steps to stabilize things, but the real victory was the shift in his mindset. He no longer saw failure as the end of the road. He saw it as a lesson, a stepping stone toward something better. And though there would still be challenges ahead, I knew that he was finally ready to face them with the courage and resilience he had always possessed, but had never fully embraced. One day, as we sat together at the kitchen table, Jason looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, the part where you told me I don't have to do everything alone. It's been a hard lesson to learn, but I finally get it. I've spent so much of my life trying to protect everyone else, thinking I had to do everything by myself. But that's not the way to live. I don't want to live like that anymore. His words struck me deeply. The boy who had once hidden his struggles, who had pushed me away in fear and pride, was now admitting that he needed others, that he was ready to accept love and support, not just from me, but from the world around him. It was a powerful moment, and I could see the weight of it in his eyes. The man sitting across from me wasn't the same one who had made a desperate choice to take out that life insurance policy. He had changed. And though it wasn't easy, it was exactly what we both needed. "We all need help, Jason," I said softly. "It's okay to lean on others. It's okay to be vulnerable. That's how we grow. And I'm here for you, no matter what." For the first time in a long time, Jason smiled. Not just a fleeting smile, but one filled with relief, with understanding. He was learning to trust. Again, to trust both himself and the people who loved him. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight, but about taking the steps, no matter how small, toward healing. As I looked at him, I realized that this had been more than just about a life insurance policy or a failing business. This had been about breaking down the walls we had built around ourselves, about confronting the truths we had been too afraid to face. It had been about learning that we didn't have to carry our burdens in isolation. And, in the process, we had both found something far more valuable than any material success: connection, understanding, and the power of unconditional love. By the time spring rolled around, the tension in our home had all but dissipated. The air was lighter, the conversations more natural. Jason's business was still on the mend, but I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The bond we had once taken for granted had been reforged through struggle, truth, and vulnerability. It was stronger than it had ever been before. And as I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set and feeling the cool breeze, I knew that this was just the beginning. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. We had both learned the power of vulnerability, the importance of asking for help, and the unbreakable bond that family shared. And with that knowledge, I believed that, no matter what came next, we were ready for it. Together.